This is Nicholas Alexiou, Department of Sociology and the Hellenic American Project, Queen's College CUNY, and we are very happy, pleased and honored to have an interview today regarding the oral history archives with a very well-known person, a great storyteller about food, and also a person who is well known for her research, books, and TV shows and PBS. Ms. DIANE Kochilas. Welcome to the Hellenic American Project and Queen's College, and thank you for accepting our invitation for this interview.
I thank you for inviting me.
Let's start with the early biographical memories we have. First of all, let's state your name and where you were born and where the family came from.
Okay. My name is DIANE Kochilas. My Greek name is Diamando. And that is very telling of where I'm from because I grew up in New York. I was born and raised in New York City, but my ancestry is from the island of Ikaria. And Diamando is a very common name on Ikaria. What was the other part of that question?
And the family, the roots of the family.
And my family roots are also 3/4 Icarian. My father was born on the island. My maternal grandfather was born on the island, but my maternal grandmother was born in Calabria, and my mother was born in the United States, in Brooklyn.
Who came first to America? Your father came here.
Well,
since your mother was born here.
Yeah,
right?
my father of immediately preceding generation. My father came to the United States in 1939.
Or just before the war?
He came out of necessity. He was of a political persuasion that made it difficult to, how can I say this, be in Greece under the government at the time.
It was the dictatorship of Metaxas.
Yes, it was the dictatorship of Metaxas. And he was also the eldest of 3 children. His parents had passed away. Or I know his father had passed away. I'm not sure about his mother at that time. I think she was also gone. And he was already in his 20s when he left. He jumped ship in Canada and made his way over the US border. And then about a year later was caught by US immigration. And he was given a choice, either to go back, to be deported and go back to Greece, which was obviously not a great choice at that time in 1940, or to enlist in the US Army. So he enlisted in the US Army, and that's how he became an American citizen. And he was at the Normandy landing. And his brother was in the Pacific. And my aunt was in Greece. His sister was still in Greece at the time. And I still have a postcard. I have that my cousin, who is a historian, found in his mother's belongings from the Battle of the Bulge. Στην Ardennes, δεν ήτανε.
Yes.
And it was
very brutal.
With all the US Army censorship stamps in Katharevousa, to his little sister saying, Αδελφούλα μου, ενοικήσαμεν. And my aunt ended up not coming to the States. She ended up in Argentina. A long, difficult family story. But my dad was, on that side of the family, was the first one to come. And never went back to Greece.
And the mother?
My mother was born in Brooklyn. She was the daughter of a Karyoti, an Icarian from a different part of the island. That we're from the north side of Ikaria. He was from the middle. in an area called Messaria. And he worked on the Italian shipping lines. And he met my grandmother in New York, who was from Calabria, and they were married. I don't know when they were married, actually. I want to go look for those records in Ellis Island for his records, because my mother was the youngest of, I don't know, 4 or 5 kids, and she was born in 1912. So they must have been married in the late 19th century. I never met my maternal grandfather. I met my maternal grandmother.
Do you know any stories how your parents met?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Do you know any stories how your parents met?
I know how my parents met. It was right after the war. You know, like many Greeks, and maybe the islanders have a stronger sense of this than people from the Peloponnese. I'm not sure. I think it's true. We have a very strong sense of place, and maybe not. I mean, I have a lot of friends who are from other parts of Greece who also have a very strong sense of the family village and going back and their roots, you know, whatever, even 3 and 4 generations down the line. But for islanders, especially for Icarians who have always been, who've always lived in exile, because Icaria has a history of exile, he went to the Cariotico Cafenio, you know, the Icarian coffee shop on the Lower East Side. After the war, that was the place where they would go to, you know, find people they knew, to find work. And he met my grandfather, who used to go there to hang out. And my grandfather was bemoaning the fact that he had a spinster daughter who was 32 years old, and he couldn't die in peace until she was married. And my father, you know, it was after the war, everybody wanted to put that behind them and move on with their lives. And he said, well, let me meet her. And they fell in love, they got married, and the rest is history.
So, in which neighborhood you grew up?
So I grew up in Elmhurst. The family lived in Brooklyn originally, and then we moved to Elmhurst. And we lived in the very early part of my life on Hampton Street in a big old house that I think my parents had bought with another family from Icaria. So it was sort of this old 2-family house kind of situation. And then at some point, I think in 1963, we moved to the house where it's still the family house. It's still in Elmhurst.
It was because the family went there because it was a Greek-American community or an Icarian community there?
I don't know that for a fact, but I assumed so because a lot of Icarians lived in the area, and the Icarian social club, the Icarian Leski, is still there and still quite active. So I assume that that's why they were drawn to that neighborhood.
So you grew up in a house where the Greek culture was very dominant. It was the language, the food, the music.
The language is interesting because my mother did not speak Greek. And my father spoke English. You know, that generation too, they were real fighters. I mean, they left everything behind. They had no choice, really. They left everything behind. My father was always very involved in the Icarian community. And the Cariotes we have a obsessive relationship with the island. And in the early 60s, you know, the island was really poor. The community here helped build roads on the island. They built the hospital, which is still running on the island, you know, sending money back. So it was always a very active involvement with life on the island, even from a distance. But what was the original question? Sorry, I went off on a tangent.
No, how evident was the Greek culture?
So the Greek culture was it was a Carian culture. We had a 3D map of Icaria on our living room wall that a very famous Icarian artist named Nikos Ikaris had made. And my family, we spoke English at home because my mother didn't speak Greek. And my mother, in fact, spoke Italian. And my grandmother her mom lived with us. She passed away when I was a kid. But I still remember hearing Italian in the house. And my parents, they spoke English between them. But culturally, it was impressed upon us that, I mean, I didn't have any friends who weren't Greek. And our community was almost all Icarian. To this day, it's a very, it's a real blessing because in a country like the United States where there's so much mobility and so much rootlessness, knowing that you belong to this place, and if need be, you can always go back there and, you can grow potatoes in your backyard and you'll survive. We all kind of have that. Like, I still have that feeling. Even though I go back to I'm going to have a house there. I spend a lot of time there now. But, being Greek was, it was the most important thing in the world. I didn't know anyone who wasn't Greek until I went to college. I mean, all right, that's a bit of a lie. In high school, I knew people who were not Greek. I went to Greek parochial school. Then I rebelled. They wanted to send me to Greek parochial high school, and that's when I said, no way. You can enroll me anywhere you want, but I'm not doing that. I'm not going to go to school. And I didn't for a few days. And I would leave the house in the morning and wander, and then my mother kind of figured it out, and she said, okay, you can go to the local high school. But where all my Greek friends were anyway. But it was a very big part of it was our life. It was a very big part of our life.
Since you are American born, how the other non-Greeks received you at school, at high school, knowing that you had a Greek background? You experienced any kind of discrimination or some kind of marginalization because of your ethnicity or your ethnic roots?
I mean, in New York, growing up in New York City, I never felt that. I grew up in the most multi-ethnic square mile probably in the world. It's a very fascinating area, Elmhurst and Jackson Heights. It's still to this day, it's extremely, ethnically very versatile. No, I can't say that I ever felt that. I certainly knew that. I mean, the first time I really encountered Americans, it wasn't even, I went to NYU, so NYU was also a very diverse school. But then I did a study abroad program, and that's when there were kids from other parts of the country, a lot of kids from Ivy League schools, a lot of kids from Ivy League girls' schools, that was a totally foreign concept to me. And that's when I realized that we were very different. Greeks are we're 3 and 4 generations, and even more. I have friends whose family came here in the late 19th century, and they still speak Greek. They still go back to Greece. They repatriate. There's some very strong bond that is very hard to break.
Yeah. So you're born here, you study here. How you identify yourself? As a Greek American, as an American?
I identify myself as an Americarian. Because I mean, I have, I'm a New Yorker by birth and temperament. You know, I know how to elbow people out of the way on the subway and, you know, spot the seat and go for it kind of thing. But I also have been going to Ikaria since I was a kid. I went for the first time in 1972. It was the Icarian, every year the Cariotas have a convention. That year it was in Ikaria, the first and only time. It was actually on the island, so it was a big deal, you know. And through the eyes of a child, it seemed like you know, this grand event. And in 1972, Ikaria was still quite poor and extremely remote. You know, the roads were really bad, but I got to the island, and my father had already passed away, so I got to the island and felt immediately that I belonged there somehow. And you asked me earlier about, you know, what was it like growing up in New York? Was Greekness, you know, a part of what was my family life like? And in our family, my house was, I mean, my mother was a saint because my father had this open door policy. Any Carioti who came to New York City, basically we hosted them. And we had a constant revolving door of people from the island who would stay, you know, for a few months usually until they got settled, until they, you know, they networked within the community to find work. And finding work was probably not so hard because by that time there were a few well-established businesses. The Cariotas were mostly in the painting business. But, you know, just coming, getting settled, this was the mid to late 60s. And when I went back in 1972, and I couldn't really speak Greek at that point, even though I was I was sent to Greek parochial schools because we didn't speak Greek at home. I was always, you know, sort of the kid who really didn't understand what was going on in Greek class. But when I got to the island, I recall, you know, many people coming up to me and, you know, saying, oh, you know, I remember you when you were really small. We stayed at your house and your parents were so generous and, you know, that we stayed with you for 3 months. And this, you know, this was more than 2 or 3 people. I mean, seemed to be a constant flow of people through our home. It was a very open and welcome place. And the Icarian community always had that element. You know, we still carry over certain traditions. Around Christmas time, for example, the tradition of going from home to home. You know, we still do that. It's really fun. You know, you go from one house to the next. I don't know, there's something really special about that. And I had friends in the neighborhood whose homes were always open to. Could always go to, you know, Mary Safas's house and there'd always be a pot of coffee and some carioti at the table and, you know, the door was always open. So I grew up, I think, feeling very, later realizing how blessed we were to have that. So I'm sorry, I talk a lot.
Not at all. This is great because it wasn't so much Greek-centered, the culture, the news that you consume at home, etc., but it was basically Icarian-centered.
It was Icarian-centered. It was. I mean, I didn't know any Greeks from any other part of Greece, except for the kids I went to school with. And the closest, and to this day, they're my closest friends, actually. The closest culturally were the Assyrians, because they had also a very tightly knit community. And I still have my 2 closest friends are from Nisiros, and, you know, grew up in New York. But in the Icarian community, there's something else that I think is very unique. My parents had their circle of friends. Our social life was centered around the Kariotiki Leschi, much more so than it was around the church or church events, which maybe New York was a little bit unique in that respect because we had other ways of connecting to each other as Greeks. But some of my closest friends to this day are the children of my parents' friends. And our kids are good friends. So my son comes down from college, he hangs out with the grandson of Mary Sappho's, who,
So you see,
it's a wonderful...
that over time, this close-knitting community continues to have close relationship.
And there's it's just this feeling of, there's no feeling of alienation. There's a certain sense of, if you really need something, there's someone in the Icarian community who will help you. And to this day, I think that's, maybe it's a little bit more diluted now, because people move out, they move into the suburbs, they're not so connected, but there still really is there's still a connection to the island.
So you are a true New Yorker. You had a degree from a very prestigious university, and then Greece. How Greece came about?
Well, I used to go as a kid. I spent almost every summer as a teenager in Greece, in Ikaria. And once you have that sense of spiritual freedom that Ikaria gave me, at least, and has also given my kids, so it's not, it's not in my imagination. There is something about the culture of that island, and I'm really hoping that it doesn't change. Once you have that sense, it's very difficult to embrace the lifestyle of the corporate life. It's very difficult to embrace that. I couldn't. I tried when I was first out of college. I had jobs in corporate America, and at some point in my early 20s, I realized, that's it. Every day is going to be the same, for the next 50 years until my Social Security kicks in. I don't think so. So I left, and I moved to Greece.
This is when?
This was in 1982.
How the family responded to that? How they felt about your...
Who? My family?
Mm-hmm.
My sisters were older than me. They were both married by then. I was always, the sort of I was the youngest. All the barriers had already been broken. My father had passed away, so my mother, I was a handful. And I was in my 20s by then. I mean, I wasn't asking for them to support me. I was, moved on by myself. I moved to Athens. And I moved as, I was 22. I wanted adventure. I wanted just to spread my wings. And it was a very interesting place, Athens, in the early 80s, because all of the excitement and freshness of post-Junta Greece, post-Karamanli era, there was a sense of euphoria in the air at that time. There was money, coming into the country from the EU. There was a lot going on. There was also the war in Lebanon, so there were a lot of Lebanese coming into Athens. I also circulated in the journalistic community there, so I was freelancing a little bit.
Where?
This was the early 80s.
What kind of job you had?
I'm sorry?
What kind of job you did in Athens?
I worked for the Athenian magazine. as a, I was a kid doing anything, writing, editing, getting coffee for the boss, all that stuff. I also worked with a very accomplished archaeologist who was the editor of the magazine at the time, Kathy Vanderpool, who was associated with the American School of Archaeology, very erudite and accomplished woman. And yeah, and then as part of my, I had one good friend in Athens at the time who I ended up marrying quite young. And then we came back to the States in 1984.
So this is a very interesting story, this transatlantic movement from New York to Greece and again from Greece back to New York. How, it was a cultural shock for you coming back?
To New York?
Yeah? Or you felt like coming back
no,
home?
New York is, I've never felt not at home in New York. It's
So
totally
New York feels like home to you also?
It feels totally at
so
home, yeah.
It is compatible to be Greek and an American? You see that it is some kind of compatibility?
Yeah, it's very compatible. You have to, you learn to laugh at the foibles of both countries. Makes you a more open-minded person, I think.
And then how you make that great success, where that came from? Is something that you had in mind, you planned, or it came by accident to choose that path?
It was an accident. I studied journalism. My father was a cook, a chef, and also in the Merchant Marine. And I was working in New York. When we moved back here in 1984, I was working in editorial in magazines, that sort of thing. And I had met this food writer who at the time was writing a column for a magazine that I was working for. He was quite well known. And food is also central to the Greek experience. I would venture to say it's a rare Greek-American family where food isn't, the centerpiece of every day. So for us, it was the same. And I always grew up, it was with a lot of my dad was the cook in the family, not my mother. My mother was a tiny lady who would forget to eat and was not particularly interested in food. But my father was a cook by profession, who also fell into that by accident because he had no choice. He left Greece, he needed to do something. He couldn't afford to study. And I was editing this food column, and one day over lunch, and it was, it was the 80s in New York. It was a crazy time. It was really sort of fun and anything goes. And, it was a little bit less controlled environment than we experience now. I happened to mention to this, John Mariani was the guy's name. He's still around. That there hadn't been a cookbook written in English about Greek food in about 10 years. The previous book was written by Vilma Liakouras, I think was her name. And I think it was called The Foods of Greece or something like that. And he said, well, write a proposal and I'll introduce you to my agent and, see how it goes. So I did. And it took about a year to sell that book. And I finally sold it, after being rejected because I was, at that point I was like, 27 or 28 years old. And nobody, knew who I was, and Greek food wasn't particularly popular or well known. And I did manage to sell the book about a year later. And I moved to Greece for a year with my husband at the time. We rented a little house in Kypseli. And I basically taught myself to cook because I really didn't know how to cook that well. I mean, I knew how to cook, but I didn't, I basically kind of figured it out as as that book deadline loomed. And I basically spent a year researching and, talking to people all over the country and traveling and collecting recipes. And I truly loved doing that. And I would test the recipes on all of our friends, many of whom were artists. So, young starving artists, free dinner, critical analysis of what they're eating. It was the perfect recipe. So I basically, that's kind of how that book happened. It was the first book, The Food and Wine of Greece. And then once you have the experience of giving birth to a book, it's a very satisfying and gratifying experience. And I wanted to continue to do that, and I, sort of found a way.
And then you realize that food is more than eating, right? It is also various sociological issues related, bonding people or differentiating people also, right? So
food is the most. Eating is the most basic, function, right? And what I discovered, and I'm not, I wish I were more academically trained, but what I realized was that in a country like Greece, where there are so many layers of history that coexist, that also is manifested in the cuisine. And my Greek wasn't that good at the time, so even in this book, there are things that, had my Greek been better, I would have understood more deeply.
Tell us more about this book, because I found it very fascinating.
This book was a little bit before its time. It was, I wanted to write a book about the regional foods of Greece. Nobody had ever even, everybody in the United States thinks of Greek food as, 5 or 6 dishes. Souvlaki, spanakopita, baklava, keftedakia, the things that we all know. But my experience, even on Ikaria, was that, there were certain dishes that were unique to the island. So I set out to research the book, and I really had no clue what I was getting myself into, because it was really like going down the rabbit hole. The more you look, the more you find. And it took me about 8 years to research the book. Not continuously, but it took a long time to research it. I also had a child during that period, and traveled with her all over Greece. Like, just put her on my back and traveled. And it's very interesting I did all sorts of research for this book, in the Gennadius Library, looking at everything from foreign travelers' accounts, because oftentimes in those accounts there were descriptions of what they were eating, and often the descriptions were Western Europeans disparaged what they were eating in 18th and 19th century Greece, because it was a country of utter poverty. But what they were describing was certainly not that different from what some of the dishes continued to be. Like in places like Crete and in a few other places, they were describing food that was still part of the local diet. I also, went back and looked at old regional newspapers, traveled the country a lot, and oftentimes found local, in every little part of Greece, in every village, there's always someone who's, a self-taught local historian, and knows kind of everything there is to know about the genealogy of the place, about the food, about what's farmed there, all sorts of things. So it's like one thing led to another, and I also documented. I was fascinated also by the variety of foods and the differences from place to place, but also to what I saw at that time. Maybe if I approached the book now, it would be different, but I realized that there were at least two main arteries that fed into what we call, Greek cooking. One is the geography of the country itself, and things that grow locally, and the other is the localized cultures that are often, and what other influences are part of those local cultures. So in the Ionian, the food's very different. In the north, it's very different. Even in the north, it's different depending on, if you're in a village where refugees from Asia Minor settled, the food is different from a village where there may not have been refugees. In the islands, every island is quite unique. So it just became it became almost an obsession. It took me a long time to finish the book. When I turned in the draft, the first thing my editor wrote to me was, "You have to cut 600 pages out of this manuscript." So I cut out all of the recipes and stories that I thought would be least appealing to Americans, and that's all of the food that, all of the ta industria, the offal.
This is interesting. Well, yeah, because you see, food as a cultural as well as a culinary history. So it is a very interesting approach that you had, and I really enjoyed the book. Also, the recent years, there are scientific studies showing that the Mediterranean diet, and in particular the Icarian, practice of food, is becoming more and more known, especially because they found people in Icaria that live a long life. So, do you have any comment on that? It is true that there's something there?
It is true. I think it's complicated because the island. I think if you looked in other parts of Greece, you'd also probably find islands where there's people eat a very simple diet. The Icarian diet, I think, the New York Times wrote that article on the front page of the magazine. Maybe it's now about 10 years ago, and I also wrote a book about Icaria and the food. The article was called the place where people forget to die. And I think it should have been called the place where people remember how to live, because it's really more, to my mind, it's more about the mindset of people. And this, we take life a little bit lightheartedly. We don't worry about that much. It doesn't takes, anxiety is not something people embrace. But yeah, I mean, the people who are now, in their 90s definitely ate a more plant-based diet. That diet has changed. So I don't know what that will mean, in the next couple of generations. But certainly the idea of not living an anxious life is very much a part of Icarian DNA.
Do you think that at this point where the planet is about 8 billion people, do we still have the capacity to feed ourselves? It is sustainable, or it is a crisis? And your experience from the pandemic, that was when we saw that the food chain was broken, supply, demand, products, people who moved to workers, seasonal workers, they couldn't find, so a lot of crops they were left there. So tell us about that. Is hunger the immediate fear or threat for humanity?
I don't know if I'm, qualified to really answer that question, but I mean, I certainly think that if we eat more locally and learn to sometimes even produce our own food, which now you can do that even in an apartment. There are all these new systems of vertical farming that don't take up very much space or use a lot of water. And if we eat less meat, I don't know, I want to believe that we'll be able to figure out how to feed each other, how to feed ourselves. I don't know, I'm an optimist by nature, so I think that there's a lot of food waste. Here in the United States, we throw out some astronomical percentage of our food every year. So if there were a way to somehow shift those balances, there is a way. It's just, it's changing the model a little bit and thinking less about the bottom line and more about what's best for humanity. And that's how I think anyway.
Also, that originated here in the States. It has to do with the way we live our lives, but also has to do with class issues, what we call fast food. And if we as Americans have anxieties about food, because it's not only hunger one of the problems, not only for America but worldwide, but also Americans have anxieties regarding food anxiety. If there's going to be enough food for the next day. Have you seen that this time that you are here in America, in New York?
I mean, I've never encountered anyone beyond people who are living on the streets who have food anxiety. I mean, Greeks have food anxiety because we always think there's never enough food. And we cook, for 30 people when there are only 4 of us at the table. I do that too. But I never throw food away. I always either repurpose it or freeze it or, find some way not to throw it away. But I mean, I was in New York during the pandemic. I was here from January to May of 2020 with my 2 kids. By chance, we all happened to be here at the same time. And I didn't feel food anxiety when I was here because I wasn't reliant on processed foods. I would come to Astoria and go to the vegetable market, and that was fine. Like it was not a problem. So I think when you're reliant on sort of the industrial aspects of food, it becomes a little bit more, the system is more fragile. But I also think that the Mediterranean diet, less of a reliance on meat would be much better for the planet.
And composting and other...
And composting. I mean, in that respect, in the United States, we're far ahead of what say in Greece. That's a really foreign concept. And it's very hard to get anything like that going without there being some just endless political back and forth. So, not that doesn't happen here too, but I think in certain things, we're a little bit more, in the United States, our culture is more prone to tackling a problem and solving it. It's more of a can-do mentality that Americans have, even though we're in this weird phase right now where there's so much division, but I do think there's a practical aspect to American culture that is maybe one of the most, dominant aspects of the culture. There's a problem, let's fix it. I'm an optimist, so.
Especially in New York, it was an over-representation, perhaps. And,
I'm sorry?
It was an over-representation of Greeks in the food industry and in diners in particular. It was almost a stereotype to identify Greeks with diner owners. But you think it's something that comes to an end now, this cycle of Greek-owned diners come to an end and we go to something else, upscale restaurants, etc.?
I mean, the Greeks gravitated to the food industry, the food business when they first came here. The Greek contribution to the American food industry is huge. And not only in the restaurant, not only the restaurant industry, but in lots of other aspects. And even in some things that we think of as totally American, the Coney dogs, Coney Island hot dogs, Cincinnati chili. There was one point when half the confectioners in the United States were Greeks. So there are a lot of interesting little nuances and details about Greek involvement in the food industry here. But the restaurants, that was an easy entree into, it was easy to find work. You didn't need to be particularly skilled. Greeks, as we like to be our own bosses. So, there was a sense of, economy. People saved money. They lived, maybe 3, 4, 5 men, to a small space. Eventually, bought the diner and then moved on and, sold it, bought a bigger diner. And then I think that was the generation that emigrated maybe in the early 60s. Although there are older diners, there are some Greek diners that are even older than that. I think there's one in Pittsburgh that's been in the same Greek family since 1951. But I think it took, that generation was concerned with, survival, with providing food for the family. They weren't visionaries in that respect. It took a comfort level and a certain level of affluence before people could start having a vision about what Greek food could be in the United States. So that's when people like Steve Jolis, who opened Periali, the first gourmet restaurant in New York City, Milos, Kostas Piliadis, the Livanos family. It wasn't John, it wasn't the father who started in the diner business. It was the son, the sons who opened Molivos. That was a leap of faith. It took multi-generational effort, to achieve that. And in some of those families, now the 3rd and 4th generation are in the business. But I also think one of the reasons the Greeks flourished in the hospitality industry is because hospitality is in our DNA, and we are really good at feeding people and sharing the giving food, give the generosity of spirit that comes with sharing food. I think that is something that really cemented, culturally cemented Greeks to the restaurant industry.
And some people in the industry think that we should remain closer to the ethnic cuisine, and some people say we should expand, go beyond. For example, Astoria, which once considered one big Greek city, and it was the cuisine, the restaurants were heavily ethnic. But now with the entrance of other ethnic groups, how much of this ethnic cuisine can survive, you think?
I mean, I think it's interesting to look at Greek food, at the evolution of Greek food from the early the earliest, I mean, I'm not the immigration, the 500 Greeks or 300, however many they were, who, landed in New Smyrna Beach, Florida, and were indentured servants, and that they didn't really have, much to say about what they were eating or cooking. But, when in the 19th century, when Greeks started coming over, and then communities started to form in different parts of the country, I think it's very interesting to see how the cuisine, how people had to adapt to their local environments. So you see Americanized versions of Greek recipes, even simple things, like spanakopita with ricotta cheese, or spanakopita with ricotta and mozzarella and maybe a little feta. But a lot of the Greek ingredients weren't available that early on, so they had to find ways to create something that was familiar using what was available. And that's a lot of that is interestingly documented in the church cookbooks, the spiral bound, just the ladies cooking for the church. They had to work with what was available to them. But I think now, look, this is also happening in Greece. It's not just an American phenomenon. We live in such a global world. I mean, you turn on the Instagram and, there are thousands of food ideas just popping out at you all the time. So I do think that some things are being diluted. And I used to think it was kind of fun, to call a dish by a traditional name, even if it was something new. But I think that ultimately it's wrong to do that. I think moussaka is moussaka. You can't call, something entirely different by a name that refers to something specific, and that's been a long-standing tradition. And I think there's now a lot of, even in Greece, I mean, there are ingredients that didn't exist there 30 years ago. So it's just human nature to want to experiment with new things and, try something new. So I think the cuisine is definitely changing in both places.
You also have a very successful series on PBS, on the public TV here in America, which is syndicated, and it plays in many different other cities besides New York. What is your main approach there? What is the core of your things you want to present to the American audience?
In that, we're in our 4th season. To me, it was about sharing the aspects of Greek culture and Greek cuisine, and I think those are interwoven, that were not really known here. Again, people have this very cliche image of Greek food, Greek wine. People still think it's retsina and keftedakia and just 5 things, but it's an incredibly rich food culture. The wines are world class, and I really set out to explore that and to share it, because ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm the product of my environment too. And being Greek is important to me. So I want to, and for some reason, we're all convinced that it should be important to everyone else too, even if they're not Greeks. So just sharing that is...
I think your contribution to bring Greek food and wine to the American audience, and not only, is extremely important, and it's very well received. But I want to know how people or authorities in Greece, how supportive they were or are about what you do for Greece.
What's that expression?
because to some extent this is like you are an ambassador.
Yeah, they don't really support it. I can speak, very openly about that. If it were not for the Greek American community, I would not have been able to produce the show. And we've gotten some, really generous support from the Jaharis Family Foundation, from the Niarchos Foundation, from private Greek Americans, from the National Hellenic Society, from, if it were not for the Greek Americans understanding the importance of promoting Greece in the United States, it wouldn't have happened, because unfortunately the mindset in the Greek public sector is a mindset that's very narrow. There's no vision. I mean, they just decided to cover one of the most exquisite examples of neoclassical architecture left in Athens, with glass panels, which is the National Archaeological Museum. I'm sorry. It's a crime against our heritage to do that. And it's absolute stupidity, because it's going to take 2 weeks for those glass panels to be covered with graffiti. So, let's call, a spade, as we say in English. I just think there's very little vision. And it's unfortunate, because the show is viewed by 2 million people an episode. And I'm really proud of having done that. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have done it. But I do wish that we had more support from the Greek government, because other ethnic groups, other shows like that have had the full support of other shows like that have had the full support of, say, the country's tourism organization. I did have the support of tourism the first year. The first year, we got a fairly large grant from them. Then then it was the New York Times travel show. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say this on camera, but anyway, I wish we had more support. We haven't had support from tourism for 2 years. That show does more to send people to Greece than any campaign they could ever have imagined. So, I don't know, go figure. I've never been, I've never been willing to compromise my integrity, especially in the Greek public sector, to gain something. So take that as you will. That's it. I wish they were a bit more supportive. But if it wasn't for the Greek Americans, we couldn't have done it.
Do you have any favorite dish, something that you really...
What's that?
Do you have any favorite dish, something that you really, stands out as very exceptional? Or there is a series of nice things?
There's so much great food. Greek food is so healthy, and there's so much great food, and I love everything. I eat everything.
Do you think that there's a connection between preparing food or consuming food and ethnic identity, that Greek Americans, although most of them, the new generation, they don't speak the language, but they enjoy the food? You think that will help them maintain some kind of ethnic identity? Absolutely.
Absolutely. When I wrote this book, I had people contacting me. It was really moving. a few people have contacted me over the years saying things like, you know, I grew up in, yeah, I don't know, Pittsburgh or St. Louis or something, and you know, my grandmother lived with us when I was a kid, and I remember she made, you know, we're from Ipiros, and she used to make this dish, and I could never find it again, and my parents couldn't remember what it was called, but I found it in your book. And that's, you know, to know that at least some of it is recorded, like what you're doing here. You know, there's some value to that. You want to pass it on to the next generation. And food is the last vestige of a culture that people shed. And within, you know, the Greek community, there's still a really strong, the food, and for us also the dancing. There's a really strong attraction, or, you know, there's something that it's a bond. It helps clarify our cultural identity.
So in our closing remarks, recently the last two census show that the American-born generation is numerically larger than the Greek-born.
I'm sorry, say that again?
The American-born generations now are in numbers more than the Greek-born. So that changes many things on how we organize our community, our syllogos, our ethnic clubs. Something you want to you know, not advise, but somehow your thoughts about the continuity of the Greek-American community in the States?
I think that's a difficult challenge. I also think the church is probably facing a similar demographic change. And I think there's institutional entities are by their nature much more slow-moving than the culture, you know, on the street, so to speak. You know, what's going on in sort of regular life. And I think that there needs to be some really well thought out strategy in the larger Greek American institutions for keeping them relevant. You know, I don't know that anyone's really done that. I think in the food world, the creative aspect of that has kept the relevance going. You know, people. I just was in a restaurant a couple of days ago, just opened in New York. It's a Greek restaurant with a very well-known American chef, and I was looking at the menu, and you know, it was definitely Greek, but it was also American. It was, you know, lobster avgolemono and spanakopita with shredded phyllo, and you know, things that were kind of an evolution. So that's one very small example of evolution that maintains some cultural identity, but also mixes. It's inevitable. The Greeks of America are living in the United States, so you can't hold on to the past and keep that, you know, as a museum piece. You have to be able to evolve, and I think the same holds true of the institutions. You know, there's got, you know, make it hip, make learning the language, you know. There has to be a reason for wanting to do that. I don't know. I think a lot of it is also people are afraid to lose their traditions, so they hold on to them, and by doing that, they become rigid. So there has to be a little bit more flexibility. I don't know. I don't have the answer to that, but.
But you are optimistic about the future generation of Greek Americans, that although they're Americans, certain parts of ethnic identity and culture food is one of them, will remain intact, or they're going to evolve it, you think?
Look, I think I was speaking to a young woman who's a food blogger in Salt Lake City, Greek American. She is fourth generation. That's a really interesting community because a lot of them emigrated from Chania. And I asked her, does she have, is there any Cretan food in modern, the local Greek cooking in Salt Lake City? And she said, well, maybe, I still make my yaya's, skaltunia, and I'm sure that recipe has somehow changed in the 100 years. Her grandmother emigrated in 1904. So, or maybe great-grandmother, I'm not sure. So I think, I don't know, there is a strong pull among Greeks to retain some aspect of our cultural identity. I don't know what it is. I think it's the really strong family bond. There's a sense of humanity that is very much a part of our culture. I don't know, we have old DNA, we've seen it all.
And also, the contribution of the previous generations to make Greek food part of the American society, and your work presenting Greek food to the American audience is a major contribution to be part of the American society, because American society, it is this mosaic, and we'd like to thank you very much for doing that.
Yeah.
And contributing, bringing the Greek elements to be part of the general American society. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you for inviting me to do this.